now going to begin this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee, where we're looking into the role of the space sector in Scotland. And we're very pleased to welcome witnesses for the three panels we'll have this morning. But we're going to start by speaking to Scott Hammond about progress towards the first launch, which I'm sure is very exciting for him and for the company, but is also of great interest to us. So there's obviously been a lot of talk about there being a launch at some point this year. Is that the basis on which you're planning?
Absolutely. So talking to the team at the start of the year where we set out our goals for this year, for us as the Spaceport, and you've got to realise we are not the launch provider. You've got those gentlemen behind me who will be able to give you far more idea of their timings. We're effectively the Heathrow, so we need to be ready. So our basic strategy this year is to complete the build, so our integration hangars, our clean rooms, our mission management centres, our flight termination systems, our tracking telemetry, the list goes on, and commission all of that and then train all of our people to be ready. The training, I really got to emphasise here, this is the first time this is being done in the UK, so we're actually creating brand new jobs, and we need to get those people suitably qualified. That takes time. We work very closely with the CAA. We've had to put in a very detailed training manual for that, which goes through how we're going to train our people, first of all, on all of our equipment, and then how we're going to rehearse for those launches to make sure that they're safe. So our aim is to have all of that done by the 1st of July, after which, the second part of the year, we are now ready for launch.
Excellent. Sounds really good. Are there any remaining steps that are giving you sleepless nights or things you're worrying about?
Lots of sleepless nights. The thing is with spaceports, I think you need to understand is first of all, they are vanishingly rare in the Northern Hemisphere to find anywhere that's economically viable for a spaceport. So, we've got a huge opportunity up in Scotland. But that means, though, that you've got to look way beyond just the 5 kilometres around the spaceport. Yes, that's very important, that we need very few population nearby. But some of our customers, when they launch, they'll be dropping some of their stages into the Pacific Ocean. That's how far we need to think. If you want a global industry, this truly is global. We're thinking 5,000 nautical miles away from our launch site that we need to think through. So that means that we have to interact with other governments because we're flying through airspace that is administered by other governments. I use the term administered because it does not belong to them. The only airspace that belongs to countries is sovereign, which is directly over the territory or the 12 nautical miles. So it's administered to them, so we do have access to it, but we still need to negotiate that. And the clients will be also dropping some of their stages and their fairings into other countries' exclusive economic zones. So all of that needs to be negotiated. So there's a huge amount that goes on in the background. And we've been working really closely, particularly with the DFT, Paul Kremen and his team there, on these negotiations with the countries as to how we can ensure the launch happens safely and satisfies their needs. So those are the sorts of things you don't see. They're not the sexy things, they're not the blue touch paper being lit, which looks great, but without that, you're not going to launch.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare, frankly.
It is, but we've been at this for 7 years up in SaxaVord, so we've been step by step to get there. What it means is you have to work in partnership with government agencies. And we very much see ourselves as a partner of those agencies. Yes, with the CAA, they are a regulator, so there has to be a particular professional relationship with them. But we still need to work with them because they're learning this for the first time as well. They're interpreting what your predecessors put into law and to make sure that it's safe. And then we need to work with the DFT, the Marine Coast Guard Agency, up in Scotland, the Marine Directorate, Ofcom for frequency licenses, and it goes on and on and on. So it's only by working in partnership with those government agencies that we're going to achieve this.
Every good luck to you. Pass on to my colleague Elaine now. Elaine Stewart.
Good morning, Scott. So thinking about the site, how has it progressed in the last year?
Leaps and bounds. This last year we've been concentrating on completing the integration hangar, which will be finished sort of before 1st of July this year. Within that there are 2 rocket halls with overhead cranes in there, and then 2 clean rooms to deal with the payloads and various offices. Now that building's between 12 and 16 million pounds, so that, that's quite a chunky number. We've also been working on Launchpad, particularly Launchpad 1 with Rocket Factory Augsburg, laying all the concrete for that, helping them with the putting their stool in, which is the bit of infrastructure that the rocket sits on prior to launch. And then we were actually doing some tests with Rocket Factory Augsburg. Now, that was really important, not only for Rocket Factory Augsburg in their research and development, but for us as a spaceport as we build up our capabilities. Because whenever we do a test like that, we have to put in place what's called a safety clear zone. What we do is we calculate the explosive value of what's on the rocket and the rocket stage, and we work out where pieces could potentially fall, and then we create an area where nobody is allowed to go in. And then we have to monitor that, so we have to clear it, monitor it, and that means that we needed to learn how to do that. We needed to work with local landowners, local fishermen, etc., and the airspace, because don't ever just think 2D, you need to think 3D. So we worked all the way through that, and as I'm sure you're aware, we had an anomaly, which is what we like to call it in this industry, in the summer. And the proof of that was nobody was hurt. I was up there, I'm responsible for safety, and I was very chilled because I knew that there was no danger to human life. So we've been working really hard on that. Outside of that, we've also we've got our range license, which is the license that allows us treat it as air traffic for space, so as we can do tracking, telemetry and flight termination. And we also got our airspace, which is within the UK FIR. So huge amounts ongoing, still lots to do. That's only one integration hangar, one pad. We aim to finish another pad this summer, and we're looking to put another 2 integration hangars onto the site and a 3rd pad soon.
Thanks. So as well as the 2 sites that's in construction, is there any other development round about it that needs to be done, and how soon would that be completed?
There is. So we're very lucky that it's an old RAF base, SaxaVord, so lots of accommodation up there for single people and families. And Frank Strang, our CEO, bought that back in about 2003. So we've been using that to accommodate people. We've got about 180 beds. But it does need a lot of maintenance, and we're looking to actually put in a new hotel to accommodate. When these companies come up, you're looking at about maybe up to 60 rocket scientists and engineers, all need to be accommodated. And I also, because I'm safety, is they need to have hot water, decent food, a nice bed, because what they're doing is very complex and, is safety minded. So we've got a lot of that. We've also done some improvements to the local roads. Fortunately in Shetland, which I do encourage you to visit, the roads are excellent. I often say if you can find a pothole, I'll give you £10. That's got you interested, hasn't it? But we had to improve it up to the site. So the last about 3 kilometres we've done a lot of road improvements, which cost us about £8 million. So lots around and about. Also working with the local community to get so they can see some benefits.
Just on the back of that, so not having those capabilities, will that affect a future launch?
All of those background, it's essential because a spaceport by its nature needs to be in an out-of-the-way place. And you need to accommodate the people. When we first started, we spoke to a lot of people who'd been to spaceports around the world, particularly over in Russia, and they had some very interesting stories to talk about. So being able to be on site with only about, it's only about a 5-minute drive to the site is immense. We visited Kodiak Island, which is in Alaska. From the accommodation to the site is, depending on the snow, between an hour and a half's drive on pretty rough road. You can't drive on your own because of the danger of bears, and you have to have a sat phone with you. So it's really important. It really means that we can take care of the people and they can do their job safely and efficiently.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you. The funding of support was signed off last year for 10 million. Has that got to you? Has it been, how far through it are you? Is it grant? Is it debt? Is it equity? What's the...
So it's convertible loan, and it's landed in our bank account, which is our financial officer is clearly very happy about. Of the 10 million, we've spent about 7 million up till now, and it's for capital projects. So the integration hangar I spoke about, the clean room I spoke about, the mission management centre, and our flight termination equipment. So we've got about another 3 million to spend. And that's probably going to be spent on things like the flight termination, which is going to be installed probably about April. And how the contract works, we pay that last part when we're happy with it.
Good. Thank you.
Harriet Cross.
Morning, thank you, Scott. And I guess following on from Angus's and looking more sort of what's happening now with obviously change government and relationship between UK and Scottish governments, what more or anything could the governments be doing at the moment to help you push forward, either sort of with current plans or future plans? Is there anything that you'd like to point to?
Oh, thank you. Yes, absolutely. For those if you saw when I was last with your previous committee, I think one of the biggest things we would like to see is a senior politician take control of space. Space covers so much throughout our country and our way of life. And at the moment, there's a whole variety of different government departments who each have a bit of a finger in the pie. MOD have a finger, DFT, you've got an environmental agency, all of these other departments. So we'd really like to see a very senior, cabinet level, grip it and say, this is what the UK wants to do with space. I'm very aware that the new government is looking for growth, and the Chancellor laid out her plans. We were disappointed to see that, or noticed, there wasn't any mention of space within that. Mainly because, space underpins everything we do in our society today. If we lost space, well, your mobile phones would stop working, etc., etc. So we need that. The other thing is space globally is growing at 9% per annum. So if you want to get on board with a growing industry, space is the one to get on board with. So we'd really like to see that. Outside of that, contracts for our launchers to launch and put satellites up into space, because we are commercially driven here, and if we have a contract from a government, bizarrely you are more trusted because you've got lots of money that you're going to pay up. So we can borrow against that, and we can show that to investors. So contracts are really, really important for us. So I think those are the biggest things for us is space czar, I know that's what the media use the name, but somebody senior, because political oversight, that this is that there's more to space than just commercial, the politics of it. There's the sovereign access to space. So in this day and age where, the international environment is a little changeable, I'm sure we all looked in this morning to see what the President has said this last night. The UK needs that. It also will allow us to operate with our European friends and allies. Two of our clients are from Germany, so we can work more closely with Germany. I would also suggest there's national pride. To become a spacefaring nation, a true spacefaring nation, I think, it would be a great thing. And we are the only nation in the world that's done it. In the 70s, we launched and put satellites into orbit from Australia. and then thought, we've done that, don't need to do it anymore. Well, I think we're now back, and we need to show that we're back.
Thank you. And then just briefly just going back onto things like licensing. You mentioned the licensing process is taking time. I know those issues with marine licensing. Just the speed of that last year, has that been resolved? And is there anything else in terms of regulation or taxation that you'd like to see which would actually help you rocket boost the industry or whatever else you want to say?
Absolutely. So without doubt, the regulatory authorities are getting better and faster as they understand. The Marine Directorate, we fully appreciate that they were never set up with this in mind. They were set up for oil and gas and, cables at the bottom of the sea, not, space objects coming down in oceans far, far away. So it's going to take time for them to build up that sort of knowledge and the skill set. But we've got a really good relationship with them. Yeah. We meet with them face to face about twice a year to discuss what we're doing and work our way through. One of the things we would really like to see is free port. Airports are quite often free ports. We see no reason why spaceports shouldn't be that. So we'd really like the government to look into that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Hammond. If you are successful and you achieve that first launch from your site, and effectively, I think the way you're describing it is the UK and Scotland would win the modern-day European space race beyond just national pride. What's your aim after that? Is it to establish a commercially viable pipeline? I'm presuming commercial payloads, rocket delivering satellites into low Earth orbit. Is that the aim? And if so, what's the time frame to become commercially viable?
It is absolutely the aim. We are a private company, so we need to make sure that we get a return on all the investment of our private investors. It's very, very important. We are giving cost-effective access to space. So if you look at our Spaceport licence, we have a licence for up to 30 launches a year. Now, we're not going to get to that straight away. We need to build to that. We need to learn how to do everything efficiently and safely. But we would see, hopefully 2-3 launch attempts this year. And we like to use the term test flight at this stage because we are still in the early days. And I'm sure that my friends behind will talk you through all of that. And then building up 8, 12 onwards. I'd also stress we are already generating revenues. So, we have money coming in from our clients, for them to use our site, and we get revenues from launch, etc. So, we will become profitable. It's very hard to say. Each of the models are different, but in the next couple of years, I would expect us to be profitable.
Okay, well, you build up then to the potential of 30 a year, and I hear that you're already generating revenue. In the interim period, do you require any further government support, be it UK government support, Scottish government support, or both?
We'd always be delighted to take government support. You
need it?
Yes and no. We would quite happily take it. If we don't get it, we will have to go out and find the extra money and work very hard. So without doubt, government support helps us. I come back to launch contracts. In the early days for these companies, that's gold dust because that allows them to get to the next launch, the next launch, the next launch. So we need to get through that. And if you look at, America, SpaceX, they've got a lot of government launch contracts, particularly from their DoD, which allows them to underpin their whole business model. So, very much so, we'd like to see that sort of support.
Do you see yourself as the UK's answer to SpaceX?
We're not, because we are not a launch provider. I wonder what my friends behind might be able to say that. We see ourselves rather as the Cape Canaveral for the UK, Scotland, and Europe, actually. As I said, I cannot stress how vanishingly rare these locations are. And as an example, if you look at America, America's got 40 spaceports. Of those 40 spaceports, 14 actually have a license. And of those 14, only 4 actually launch because they're the only commercially viable places to launch from. I'm afraid, and I say it looking at all the politicians here, each one of you loves to have in your constituency a spaceport because it sounds great, sounds sexy, something you can talk about. But to actually find a commercially viable location, very, very rare. And so if you're looking at competition in Europe, on mainland Europe, it's us and Andøya in North Norway.
Well, beyond national pride, what do we get for our investment then? Obviously, the overriding aim is about economic growth and high-value jobs, but what do we get for our investment? Do you anticipate government having launch contracts with you? Do you anticipate government use of it beyond commercial use?
Absolutely. I would see government launch contracts in putting satellites up into orbit, environmental monitoring, the Ministry of Defence, to have that ability. There's a lot of talk of reactive responsive launch, which is about putting satellites back up into space for the MOD should they be taken down by an adversary. And only that can be done from a sovereign launch site. So I do see it from that. The jobs, we're already building up. We've already, taken on, a young 17-year-old lad who lives up in Unst, teaching him how to become a spaceport operator. So we're already working on that. We've got a big STEM program trying to encourage people into this whole industry. And that will only build as the capacity and the sort of number of flights from us increase.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Pleasure.
Chair.
Next question's from Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Got a few avenues I'd like to explore with you, Mr. Hammond, that's okay. Mm-hmm. We talk about the national pride, and I think about it as maybe a space race. I don't know whether you think about that in the same way, but yeah, I think you just mentioned Andorra and Norway, did you, in your previous remark? How do you stand in terms of progress versus them? And it'd be nice if you could comment on that, and then maybe how confident you are of hosting that first orbital launch from Western Europe.
So it's very difficult because the Norwegians keep their cards very close to their chest. Yeah. What I would say is Andøya has got 20, 30 years experience of doing suborbital launches, okay, which are launches that enter space but don't achieve orbit. Yeah. So they've got that sort of experience ahead of us. They did receive a spaceport license back end of last year, which will allow them to launch. But their launcher, ESA Aerospace, is yet to receive its launcher license. So it's very difficult to say quite where they are on that whole process. We talk about this sort of thing quite often, but I guess it's the analogy, the football managers say, concentrate on your own game.
Indeed.
And that's all we do, is just concentrate on what we can do and be ready for that first test flight.
Just in terms of expanding that analogy, globally from European, in our packs it talks about some of the information we've provided that Western Europe isn't doing this so much, and you mentioned in your introductory remarks the Northern Hemisphere. Is that commercial realities? Is that geographical realities? Why is Western Europe not in the global?
We talk about space-locked countries. So much like you have landlocked countries, have space-locked countries. It comes back to that point I'm talking about, that 5,000 nautical miles, because when you launch a rocket, it is a hazardous undertaking, so you do not want to overfly population centres or land masses. And so it all comes back to safety. Now, you also, Northern Hemisphere, you find somewhere that hasn't got a population, that's quite difficult. The next thing is you are going through airspace, and that means it has an impact on other air users. So you want to be in a very quiet piece of airspace, which again, where we are nicely up north, is good. The next thing is those drop zones coming down on the marine environment. You don't want to be doing that in really busy shipping lanes, etc., etc. So you end up actually
Bit going on.
Absolutely, you end up with all of this. Now, America is quite, they're isolationist, aren't they? They're their own continent's a long way away. They don't have other people. But if you look at UNST, the flight information region changes from the UK to the Icelandic one, 12 nautical miles north of UNST. So, that shows you straight away the complexity. The exclusive economic zones don't match up with airspace. So you have that. There are areas which are, don't belong to anybody. And then we'll also pass through Norwegian airspace potentially, Greenland airspace, Canadian airspace, American airspace. So it's really a function of geography that the northern hemisphere is just far more populated, therefore far busier.
That's clear, thank you. The other point I just wanted to ask about was contracts. You've referred to this a couple of times, and it's clear that government contracts can underpin your leverage and help you build as a business. And you said that the Department for Defence in the US underpin some of your equivalents in the US. So what does the MOD do at the moment? So I'm assuming we still require space. So are they piggybacking on American technology, or are they placing these contracts in a non-sovereign somewhere else? How does
at the
that
moment,
work? What would need to change?
The UK MOD, I think, has probably only got 2 satellites. So we do rely on Uncle Sam very much for all of that. And I believe their thinking at the moment is to piggyback onto a SpaceX launch because they see it as a cheaper option. We would encourage against that. And for a whole variety of reasons outside the sovereignty. I was on a Global Spaceport Alliance meeting where we had somebody from the US Space Force talking about what their requirements are for the next up to 2030, and they've effectively booked all of the launches from the States until 2030. So if we want to get UK satellites up there, we're going to have to find another way of doing it.
Thank you. I know we're not coming to conclusions yet, Madam Chairman, but I would say that in the increasingly less globalised world, and what's happening in the US, this sovereign capability is something that we should be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hammond. That concludes our questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Resume our meeting. Good morning, Mr. Smith, Mr. Chambers. Thank you very much for coming along this morning to what's proving to be a very interesting session already. My first question would be to Mr. Chambers. I'm conscious that you paused construction of your own facility at Sutherland last year and switched your operations to SaxaVord. What prompted that decision?
It was a purely commercially driven decision based on the amount of capital that would be required to finish the spaceport versus how much capital we would require to finish the rocket. We set out, Orbex is a pre-revenue business, we only get paid when we start launching satellites, and on a commercial basis, there'll have to be some test flights first. We set out to raise a 55 million Series D financing round after last summer. By the time we approached autumn, we had not been successful in raising the complete amount. Obviously, you're aware of the subsequent developments there. But it became apparent that we would have to find a way to optimise our cash flow, and the biggest sort of single expense that we had was the around £15 million required to finish the Sutherland Spaceport. So we started negotiations with the SaxaVord team and Scott to discuss, what kind of options there would be to move there, given that that spaceport already had a license, and much of the infrastructure that's required, which we heard in the previous session, had already been constructed. And therefore I made the decision that it made the most financial sense to pause construction at Sutherland for now, develop the capacity, so we have a permission for 10 launches a year from SaxaVord so far, and then as and when more capacity is required, we can finish the construction at Sutherland and and carry on there, or develop capacity in other places. That seemed to be the most prudent way to get the launcher finished, and therefore the best way to secure the jobs and the economic development we're trying to create in Scotland.
I presume, though, is there's still some long-term plan for Sutherland? It's something
Absolutely.
you still would like to pursue?
So Orbex's business plan has us ramping the Prime micro launcher. That's the first vehicle we're building, up to 24 launches per year. As I mentioned, we have permission for 10 from SaxaVord. So we need to find the capacity for the other 14. The most logical place to find that is obviously in the partially developed site. We would need that capacity by 2028, and therefore, construction would have to start prior to that.
Very interesting. I'm going to pass over to Susan Murray now, though.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Phil. So you're retaining the lease on Sutherland, but you're not developing it. Are you doing anything in the background? Are you working on licenses or?
Yes, we're doing a couple of things. The first is to fulfil the planning consents, that to do with drainage, the various bits of peat restoration, security to prevent unauthorised access. We're obviously continuing on with the licence application as well. So that was a thing that was in process of the Civil Aviation Authority. So we're getting the Spaceport and range licences there, whilst we continue applying for the launcher licence now from SaxaVord. So we've modified that application. So that would leave the site in a good place, ready to restart construction when the time is right and when we have sufficient funds to do so.
So would you think it appropriate, given the amount of public funding that's gone into the site, to perhaps speak to Highlands and Islands Development Board and see if there was another organisation that wanted to use it, or are you confident that your activities are progressing towards using the site? I mean, you mentioned 2028, and so that's not very far away.
It's not that far away, and we're reasonably confident that we need the capacity. Our business plan requires us to have more capacity in order to hit break even and become a commercially viable business. We are in discussions with Highlands and Islands about different options. So certainly there is an open dialogue there. I actually met them yesterday. We tend to meet them on a weekly basis. So we're certainly looking at ways that could potentially be accelerated. But it's expensive to change the decision. In terms of how you get the license, operationally, there's lots of equipment that needs to be installed. Once SaxaVord have finished completing the pad, then there's a bunch of technical equipment that we need to install. So it's not a decision we took lightly, and not one that is easy to chop and change. We really have a new plan now, which is do the first 10 launches a year from SaxaVord, and then look for the additional capacity in Sutherland.
Thank you very much.
Angus MacDonald.
Can you explain the impact of Anders Poulsen's involvement in your plan in Sutherland and the move to Shetland?
So there were a number of objections to the planning permission before my time at Orbex, and there was a judicial review, I think in the High Court, which we won. We then had to modify the planning permission because it became apparent that situating the radar station at the spaceport itself wouldn't have enough line of sight over the horizon. So we submitted a new plan which, the main difference, there were some minor things, but the main difference was to move the radar site from the spaceport to the top of the Bentong mountain. That required, obviously, planning permission modification, so we had to submit it again. And there were, a number of objections to that scheme. I will stress there is already communications infrastructure on the top of that mountain, so it's got a mobile phone mast up there. However, the planning permission was granted late last year, so in terms of Mr. Paulson's sort of influence, it hasn't prevented us getting our planning permission either the first time or subsequently.
Mr. Stewart.
This is for Mr. Smith. So the current status of the Pathfinder launch that you're involved in following the ABL withdrawal of its commercial launch services, where are you with that?
When we set out on the launch program and the Pathfinder launch program, as you described, our intent always from the outset was to think about how we stimulate the broader business. So it was far more about stimulating the ecosystem. So we ended up having two parts of the program, two parts of the launch. One was working with a spaceport and then also bringing a launch provider across to be able to create the launching capability. But then, and as we've heard very well from Scott, is how do you then drive the demand that will lead to the viability and the continued viability of those spaceports, as well as deliver the economic benefit to the region that really comes from space, because it only really makes sense if you put something in space and actually generate some benefit from that capability. So actually we've got two parts of the program. Said one of those was with ABL as our launch provider. We're now looking for another launch provider. So we're in conversations with a number of launch providers, and there are an increasing number of those coming out, and you'll hear from some of them this morning, which is great. But the second part of that, which was the development of an orbital maneuvering vehicle and also then bringing some commercial customers, that continues. And that part of the work actually is progressing as expected. So we've still got to find a launch provider, but we've seen there's a spaceport. We've seen a number of launch providers and launch service providers coming onto the market, which is fantastic as the market changes. And we'll continue developing the orbital maneuvering vehicle and the manifest, the sort of commercial satellites that will go on that to be able to generate the jobs and the benefit that comes from that.
Thanks, and I think you answered my second question there, and that was about your objectives, and are you quite confident that you're going to deliver on them?
Yeah, from the sense that, and we're slightly different from some of the others here, and it's probably worth just explaining that we're not a launch provider, we're not a spaceport provider, we're actually more on the consumer side. So we've heard already about how important it is for the viability of the launch providers, the spaceports, is to have that demand. And I think that's a really important element of this, is you can become quite focused on spaceports and launch, but it's only worth it if you're going to do something with what you actually put into space, what you do with the space itself. And that's where we're really focused as a space company. There is no doubt that there is huge demand for launch. There is no doubt that there's huge demand for space-based systems right across all the different mission areas. We touched on things like how do we tackle the climate crisis? Someone's mentioned that already. That fundamentally we need space-based assets. So I'm in no doubt that there is a strong, vibrant space market that we can be part of. What we're doing at the moment, stimulating some of that demand, bringing in some of those space companies, allowing them to look for the UK as a place to launch from. We're doing that already, so I think that's part of it. So I'm no doubt that the objectives of putting the UK and Scotland at the forefront of the space market, absolutely we can achieve it, as long as we continue with the same level of impetus, focus, and with some of the elements of support that Scott has already mentioned. With those things in place, there's no reason why we can't achieve it.
Just on the top of that, do you think that government still need to back this programme? Space
as a market, it's a globally competitive market, and I would argue that there are no space sectors globally that operate in purely commercial conditions. And we need to be alive to that, I think, as we consider all the policy decisions we make in the future. We've heard about US models where actually the spaceports there, many of them actually exist on military bases with an element of support that comes from that, as well as the driver demand from things like the DoD and other government consumers. You can look across anywhere in the world where actually, look across Europe where they have a strong European Space Agency backing through their Ariane space launch, which again is very much driven by institutional demand, and that's how they pull it through. So I think we have to recognise that the global space market generally is supported by governments because governments see it as a strategic sector, both for economic reasons but also prosperity and security reasons. Scott mentioned it, and I just want to take the time to echo it. You do launch because, as nationally, you want to have secure access and assured access to space. Most nations recognise that, which is why they support their spaceports. So it's a long answer. My response is yes, we need continued government support, but it can take many forms, but it definitely needs to be there.
You're on that point. Hasn't the UK government given you additional investment last week of £20 million into Orbex?
Not us, but Orbex.
Orbex,
yes, but generally as a launch. And I would say that's a really positive sign. And in fact, I would commend actually that kind of what I see to be a relatively progressive and ambitious way of doing this. It was a different investment model than we've seen previously, and it's exactly those kinds of models that we need to see. It's exactly that kind of thing that I think will make a difference. But let's be clear, when we compare that to the level of investment that comes from other governments around the world, it's only starting to scratch the surface of what it takes to do this. And I think even when you consider the benefit, both economic and security benefit that comes from being a spacefaring nation, it's not a huge investment.
What is the investment model? Has the UK effectively become a shareholder in Orbex with that 20 million?
So it's a convertible loan note, the 20 million. So it's money that's loaned to the company where the government has an option to become a shareholder at a future equity raise, or indeed the option to not become a shareholder. So that's the model. Generally speaking, it's the same model as the SaxaVord investment March last year. It's fairly standard in the investment world that those do turn into equity and are not repaid.
What has that 20 million enabled you to do? Has that allowed you to accelerate your current development?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that 20 million has secured over 150 high-tech jobs in northern Scotland. It's put us on a very good path to our first launch this year. And I think more than anything, it's sent a signal to Europe and the world that the UK is now backing a sovereign launch capability that's being built in the UK and Scotland. And that, I hope, will make it much easier to unlock private investment for the company.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Gents, if you could talk to me a little bit more, and I think all of us are wanting to hear some good positivity here on what Scotland's USP is here. What is it that distinguishes us differently from elsewhere that's going to be able to allow you to attract that commercial investment which is required to make sure that this is a success, not just for yourselves, but also for Scotland and the wider UK economy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first obvious one, and the point that Scott made in his session, was the geographical gift, if you will, of having open sea in a northerly direction with not much population. Means that it's actually an ideal place to situate spaceports. We also have in Orbex some great facilities just down the road. So we do our integrated stage tests and some of our engine tests and environmental tests and structural tests at the Kinloss Barracks. So the MOD have been kind enough to rent us a fairly significant site with obviously great security, which is 8 minutes from our rocket factory on the Forest Enterprise Park. We've obviously been supported by the local regional development agencies, so Highlands and Islands Enterprise, have supported us with the spaceport build. They've also supported us with some of the equipment. And we are able to draw on a pool of engineering talent that is coming out of the oil and gas sector, and some of that supply chain too. So, for instance, we've just built a large vertical test stand on the Kinloss Barracks, which was built by Motive, from Aberdeen, using the same types of skills that you would use in offshore. So I think many advantages. And it's also, a great place to live, right? So we've relocated many people from around Europe to live in northern Scotland.
Does the strength of the US market, and in particular SpaceX, does that impact what you're seeking to achieve, or the viability of what you're seeking to achieve? And in terms of that, being able to attract that commercial side of things, are you looking at low Earth orbit, mid Earth orbit, high Earth orbit? Are you looking at in relation to GPS? Are you looking at navigation? Are you looking at satellite? Are you looking at comms? Is there a specific thing which is going to distinguish yourselves from SpaceX in order to be able to compete with the scale that they have, and now obviously the open access they have to the US government?
It's a great question with perhaps a complex, long answer. I mean, I think what you've got to understand about Orbex is we're building, the first vehicle we're building is a micro-launcher called Prime. It can put 150 kilograms into low Earth orbit in its initial operating capability, and we intend to develop the payload capacity to be able to grow that through technical upgrades, which is quite a common path. This is, you can think of this as roughly equivalent of Falcon 1, which is Elon's first rocket. The unique differentiator is that it's an entirely sort of carbon fibre, so it's super lightweight. We've built the world's first carbon fibre cryogenic coaxial tank right in Scotland with a global patent, and we're using biopropane as a fuel. So we've built an engine system architected around a fuel which delivers up to 96% less emissions than a standard kerosene rocket. In terms of pure competitiveness, the smaller your launcher is, just due to the laws of physics, you won't be able to get the same type of cost per kilogram as a Starship will. However, for missions that require specific orbits, for payloads that are around that right size, and for people who care about the environment, then it is a great solution. To get cost competitive with SpaceX, you need to build bigger rockets, and that is where our product roadmap comes in. Through the European Launch Challenge, we intend to put forward a design for a medium lift vehicle, around 8 tons to low Earth orbit. But then, as you mentioned, that vehicle would be capable of medium Earth orbit, of geostationary, of lunar missions, of interplanetary probes, science. So you can think of it a little bit like a Soyuz replacement. And that vehicle would also be capable of delivering much lower cost per kilogram due to the economies of scale, and make it easier to compete with SpaceX. In terms of that global market, I would echo what Nick said. There is a significant European institutional market which, until quite recently, was closed and was only really open to Ariane Group and Arianespace. However, Flight Ticket Initiative was launched last year. Orbex was one of only 5 launch companies in Europe to win a ticket to launch EU institutional payloads. We obviously have a subsidiary in Denmark. So we do think that is a very significant market with which to be able to bootstrap, commercial payloads to then tackle the global market in the longer term. But this is a stepwise thing, and you've got to look at, SpaceX went from Falcon 1 to Falcon 9 to Falcon Heavy to Starship. There were 4 vehicles in that transition. So what you're telling us is that Scotland's way to take on SpaceX in the States and succeed. Okay, we'll take that. Just one quick follow-up to Nick on a slight tangent. 2,500 jobs, 2,500 places linked to Northumbria University in the northeast of England. Why did Lockheed Martin choose to put its efforts there and not into Scotland, where of course the spaceport's going to be?
And I'll start by saying the relationship with Northumbria is not exclusive. Let's start there. But we've already got a footprint across the UK. We've already got some other footprints in Scotland, and clearly building our relationship with Saxon, looking for opportunities to build that as well. And we go right through the nation. We are a UK company going right the way through the nation. Northumbria, a little bit of serendipity at times. We ran a supply chain event there and built a relationship with Northumbria, and they leaned in as a university and helped us out. But actually, even recently, we've had a team up in Scotland at Strathclyde having a conversation about how we can extend that ecosystem. And from the outset, for those who don't know, the relationship with Northumbria University, we've created a Northeast Space Skills and Technology Centre, and the idea behind that is to create kind of an ecosystem, a one-stop shop to be able to sort of bring through talent, do development of ideas and ideation, and then bring that into production. But recognising that actually the power of that will be how you can build a broader network around it. So we've already started having conversations with some institutions in Scotland to see how we can do that. We ran a supply chain event actually late last year as well, in Glasgow, looking for where we can start finding the nuggets of these ideas. Now maybe we will use the nest as the way of doing the incubation of those. Maybe we'll find another way of doing it. But it's not exclusive. It was a great opportunity for us to start building something at the centre of this. That very much is the point of this. It's the kernel, it's the hub, but then where do we reach out from there? We've already started doing the links into Scotland. So hopefully that allays any concerns that we're being exclusive. We're not. We're looking for opportunities to partner wherever we can across the nation.
certainly fair to say that Strathclyde University has great ambition in that particular area, as I've found.
Yeah, they let us know very clearly, as they always do. Yeah.
Thank you. Harriet, Chris.
Thank you. A really quick follow-up just on launch licences. Probably Phil is best, but Nick, do jump in if needed. And how does the process of obtaining them here compare to internationally? And are we at the stage where they're sort of overly constrained, overly regulated, but we're sort of losing pace with what's happening abroad, or is the process here right? Because I know you said you still haven't received yours. Yep, the Spaceport we know is sort of July, will sort of be ready for launch. Is there an overlap there which is not going to match up?
Orbex. I think they were referring to the RFA first launch for July. We are targeting sort of Q4, so we think the license is on track. In terms of the process, I couldn't really comment on getting a license abroad because we've never tried it. However, I would say that the CAA have been absolutely great to work with. It's obviously fairly new for them as it is for us, and it's a fairly complex task to license a spaceport, a range and a launcher. But there's a great team there, and we honestly don't really have any complaints, and we're working together effectively. So from my point of view, I don't think there's a big change required.
I would agree. I think we've seen, for those who've been doing this some time, working with the CAA for some time, we've seen a real change in their approach. I think those, and Scott mentioned it as well, because of course it's not just the launcher, it's the satellites that will go on there, they have to be licensed as well, so it's everything and the spaceport. I think we've seen a real change in the way they're doing the approach of it. They're very collaborative. I think it's very important. I would say globally, and I look to possibly the more mature ones, which would be France or the US, because they've had long-standing ways of doing licensing, they can sometimes be a little bit more formulaic, take a little bit longer, I would say. So the approach that the CAA is taking is very positive. However, and it comes back to a question that was asked around Scotland's USP, there are some elements where this does become a discriminator, and I think as you think about refinements of things like any regulation or any of these licensing processes, understand that will be potentially one of the discriminators for launching from the UK and from launching from Scotland. So it's always good to continue to review, continue to refine, because these are the things that companies will look for when they make a decision about where they can launch from. And as I said before, this is a globally competitive market, and we're going to make sure that we don't give any reasons for people to look elsewhere.
Thank you.
So, thank you. I just ask you both, have you seen any change in the UK government's approach to the space sector and to launch since the new administration came in? And I know we've spoken about contracts, but I'd just be interested to hear what your general opinion on that is.
I think we have. Firstly, I would say that space is a refreshingly non-partisan thing, and I think most all flavours of politicians seem to be fairly behind the space sector and supportive of what we're trying to do for the UK. However, I would say that the UK government taking giving a convertible loan directly to Orbex and taking a sort of position in us to develop this sovereign launch capability with a British-made rocket launching from British soil, built in Scotland. It does seem like a change to me, and certainly a welcome one.
Okay. So though it's not specifically mentioned, they're actively doing it in terms of growth. They're recognising it's there.
For me, I think I just echo some comments that Scott made earlier as well, which is it's true that space, and we do hear it quite often, the conversation around space and the importance of space for the UK in a number of ways, both from a prosperity and from a security perspective. I think it's very important. But I do also think that we need to make sure that we do have that right advocacy in government. And I think there has been, to some extent, a splitting of the responsibilities across different ministerial positions as well. I think we're seeing, it felt when we had things like a National Space Council that we were getting some broader cross-government sort of interfaces. That may have dissipated slightly with the change of administration. I think it's coming back together again as people start to focus on it and get some time in government to come back to it. I would just push back, I would just echo the point that Scott made, that we do need some kind of national champion to make sure that all those different interests, because space it's a cross-department, cross-government interest. We need to make sure there's someone there coordinating that. I would really like to see some emphasis on that. And the other thing we've got, which is going to be very telling for us as a sector, of course, is the industrial strategy. And I really want to see that space factors quite significantly in that industrial strategy, because that'll be very important, not only for those of us operating in the UK space sector, but it's a real declaration, I think, globally about how this government is getting behind the UK space sector and why the UK is the right place to come and do space or space-related activities. So I think we need to make sure that the industrial strategy really reflects that.
I could absolutely second that. I think it's crucially important that space is written clearly into the industrial strategy, maybe as part of advanced manufacturing or perhaps on its own. And I think that will help join some of the dots that we talked about. If I could just highlight one area, we've been talking to the National Wealth Fund, formerly UK Infrastructure Bank, around support for building a large-scale manufacturing facility in northern Scotland. And after looking at it for some time, the answer we got was, space isn't in our mandate. So the question is why, and what does it take to get space in there to support this job creation? I think that would be critical, because it's obviously a fund with extremely large financial firepower that could support large-scale infrastructure projects that we require to scale up the production of rockets.
And without wishing to go too far in this question line, but I think it's quite important, is what we have found previously is, we talked about it before about how it's very important to have government support in some form to support the space sector. And that way you sort of deliver the benefits on the back end. And Scott talked about sort of where we've seen things like defence interest in it. Well, one of the things we've had previously is the only real programs that could operate sort of nationally at scale as fully funded were defence programmes, because of the way that actually most of the UK Space Agency funding was provided through a DSIT mechanism, which meant there were often grants as opposed to real programmes or national programmes. Things like the industrial strategy would allow the levers for us to actually pursue really ambitious national space programmes. And that's why it's so important for us, because we think it's both, again, to support the industrial base and to grow the industrial base, but also to make a clear statement about why the UK is a place to come and do space. Having those kind of large national programs, ambitious national programs, which would be sort of allowed through the right levers in the industrial strategy, is really important.
Just to look more further into the future, because clearly this is long-term planning and development and investment. With regard to all this payload that's being put up into space, this is clearly international, and a lot of different owners of different bits of equipment up there. Has there been any discussion, are there any plans ever around bringing things back down to Earth after they've finished their usefulness?
I think there are two aspects to this. I think firstly it's really important that we adhere to a sort of zero debris policy, and that there is a plan to deorbit rocket stages and bring them back down to Earth, and the same is true for satellites. The second part is, there are a number of commercial companies now that are looking at how to tackle the problem of space junk, which is an increasing issue. I think the big question is who's going to pay for it, because it's incredibly expensive to clear it up. So I think that the biggest single thing we can do is make sure that nothing is launched into space without a plan that doesn't leave any debris whatsoever.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. That comes to the end of our second session. So we'll go into private session to allow a changeover, but thank you very much. It's very interesting indeed. This really is a question to all of you this morning, and thank you for coming along and being willing to give us evidence. It's very helpful. But I wondered, we've heard a lot about the conditions that are required for a space launch area, and from Mr. Hammond earlier, and about why SaxaVord worked in that context. Are there any other reasons why your companies have been attracted to that particular location? I'll start with Mr. Brooker.
So I think one of the most significant ones is, of course, the geography. It's the airspace, the marine space, as well as relatively uncrowded. There is in Scotland and the UK a good manufacturing base of aerospace businesses which can form part of the supply chain of the companies we're building. And I think that's one, and the skills base is also there. So I think those two things are perhaps the most significant ones, as well as the UK being relatively advanced compared to other European nations in terms of the regulation for space launch and having a process for getting a license to do it in the first place.
Spurmann, were there any other reasons why your company was interested?
No, definitely. I second what was said before. So these are definitely all good arguments that also resonate with us. For us, I think specifically, we met like-minded people, I would say, in Scotland, and specifically in uns with the SaxaVord Spaceport people. People I see who see, same as we do, space as the future of humanity and great to the overall society and the benefits that we will have locally from that. And specifically with SaxaVord being a private company and being a private operator, it's much simpler to act and work with than at other spaceport locations that we have around the world and anywhere close to where we are at the moment, I would say. It means that we can have a call on sea level with Scott and us and take a decision and move forward. There's no state entities or agencies involved which we need to relay decisions through to move forward. And this, I think, is one of the most important factors that we need. You know that we are very far behind the other spacefaring dominating nations around the world. And if we want to catch up and do something that actually makes sense in space, we need speed. And speed to catch up, and that means speed in decision taking and speed in the overall environment. And this is a major decision of why we choose this spaceport to get to.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, anything extra from you?
Sure, I think I would say that SaxaVord, so in general, the ability to launch from the north of Scotland, whether it be SaxaVord or any other location, is the UK's offering to the space industry in general and the launch industry. I would say that, as mentioned by Scott, this idea of responsive launch, getting into orbits over the Arctic, there's no one else doing it at the moment. There's space to do it. And as mentioned already, the geographic aspects, which mean there is not significant human activity north of SaxaVord. There is. But yeah, it's the unique location, the ability to launch at a given time. The one thing I would say in particular, at that kind of displacement north, there's a lot of wind. And the one factor that, in our experience, having tried to launch in Iceland, the one factor that supersedes any regulatory challenges and everything else is the wind. Because if you can't manage the wind, well, you can't manage the wind, you can't launch when you want to. So, but yeah, I think SaxaVord, from the point of view of the United Kingdom, is probably the best location to be able to do that. And access, as I said, the Arctic inclinations, the orbits, the sun-synchronous and polar orbits that we're looking to. In fact, it wasn't mentioned earlier on, but I think the majority of the satellite manufacturers in Scotland are actually still looking at Earth observation data capture. So the satellites that are being manufactured here in Glasgow, in and around Glasgow, are looking to do sun-synchronous or polar orbits, which is orbiting from pole to pole. And for that very reason, the launch service offering to be able to support these satellites and the growth of that capability and the growth of the capability of Scotland has in terms of data capture, Earth observation data and manipulation and interpretation, we need to be looking at polar orbits. So I think that's the end-to-end join-up piece. Why SaxaVord? Why launch? Why Scotland? And what are we actually looking forward to?
That's very interesting. So, in a sense, that's one of Scotland's USPs then, is that capability.
Absolutely. So when we set ourselves up, Skyrora was set up in 2017, we were looking very much to fill that logistics gap, to be able to inspire and allow more satellite companies more regular, frequent access to space. And one of the first conversations we actually had was with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, because we at that stage already knew that the SEPA was a major stakeholder, or rather consumer, of space data. So we see ourselves, or saw ourselves at that point in particular, an enabler to capture better space data and to support the constellations that Scotland's manufacturing to be able to do that. That's how we fit ourselves into that value chain. So we believe that is, again, a very valuable point about and the future of why we're doing this. It's not just putting new satellites up there endlessly, it's actually supporting what's there, doing it responsibly in a sustainable manner, as asked as well, and looking to support and potentially remove from orbit these satellites at the end of life.
Thank you. That's very good. A question to all three of you. I think I'm right in saying that your companies have had an interest or expressed an interest perhaps in other launch sites across Europe. Would it be your intention to continue interest in those, or are you sort of spreading your bets, or are you thinking that you'll focus on one particular launch site in the future? I'll start with Mr. Brooker again, if I may.
We are not currently looking at any other launch sites in Europe at the moment. We definitely see SaxaVord as our primary launch site for the same reasons that Alan said, is that it's access to polar and sun-synchronous orbits, which is where most of the small satellite market are. As we grow and expand, there will become orbits that are harder to access from a northern hemisphere, and there are a couple that you can access from a more equatorial location. So we do see a route to grow our offering of destinations, which could be offered from other launch sites at an equatorial range. That doesn't mean to say it's not possible to get a satellite from SaxaVord into a low inclination orbit, but it's not as easy as it would be from another site.
I think I start a bit broader again. I think Scott mentioned earlier when we started this overall session, Heathrow Airport. And I think this is what we ultimately will get to, or have to get to, that rocket launch happens next door, other side of the river. We will see rocket launches maybe in future, same as the space. The airport at the moment is very close to the city. Right? In the origins of air travel, airports also very remote, same as Spaceport are today for safety reasons. But I think at some point they don't have to be, and this will all depend on how often do you fly, how reliably can you do that, and how can you ensure public safety with doing so. And in that matter, obviously, I hope that in the long run there will be more and more spaceports around the world. But also I think we are all under the understanding that it will probably be some decades to go until we will see that. So for now, definitely our baseline spaceport is with SaxaVord, and that is a very good partnership so far for us. But also, we all are under the same understanding that we cannot launch all satellites to all orbits from that location. Right? There are certain inclinations we cannot get to due to the safety and whose other countries we overfly, who are maybe not our closest friends as of today. And in that overall evolution over decades might change, but as of today it's not. So with that, we need other locations closer to the equator or lower inclination sites around the world from which we can access then and make all our customers happy who essentially want to fly with us. And for that, yes, obviously, we need another spaceport. And ultimately, our plan is to advance, to build more spaceports. We have a very modular concept to build each and everywhere. And it must be that we are providing a service level with our launch service that is in favor of the customer. And that means that we operate in the proximity of customers, right? And that means that we take that concept that we have and that we can ideally build it anywhere around the world to make operations simple and cheap for the customers.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, do you have a view on that one?
And yeah, just to basically support what Jörn just said there, the concept of responsive launch is where we think we have an opportunity to compete with the United States, or rather provide a valid offering that they will recognise and tolerate, let's say, put it that way. From that point of view, responsive launch means, and in our concept, means not being limited by infrastructure of any specific place on Earth. We are already looking, and in our planned launch for later this summer, we are planning to look at the possibility of telemetry coming from space to our launch vehicle, rather than having a ground control station to track and to talk to our launch vehicle. We're looking to undertake a proof of concept to actually replace that or demonstrate that it can be done from space. What does this mean? This means that we don't think that we need to be limited by heavy, cumbersome infrastructure going forward, particularly from the environmental point of view. And from that point of view, yes, we are at the moment intending to and look forward to developing our relationship with SaxaVord so that we can start that process. But as I mentioned already, we undertook a test launch from Iceland because we have the entire infrastructure that we think we need, which is mobile, to allow us to do that or undertake this concept of responsive launch. So we believe that we remain open to, as Jörn just said there, customers' requirements and how we are able to respond to them. And from that point of view, we have a relationship with, we've had a dialogue with a number of the spaceports in the Northern Hemisphere, including, as we mentioned already, SaxaVord, Andoya, S-Range. It was us who created the Icelandic regulations to allow launch to happen in Iceland. And yes, we have a dialogue with Canada in particular. We're also interested to learn more about Amman Spaceport, which I believe also has a connection into SaxaVord. So we're staying open because we want to be responsive, we want to do it better. We believe that by doing it better, we can actually get a better price or have a better effect for our customers.
Okay, thank you very much. Harriet Cross.
Thank you. Mr. Spurmann, you've received your operator licence. What now are the steps before you're able to launch? And are there any particular barriers in the way which are going to sort of change that timeline?
Well, first of all, we're obviously very proud and very happy to having received it. I think it was a good process, quite long process, but yeah, finally we arrived here together with CAA, which we are very happy to work with. Overall, obviously, has been a very complex and long way. 3 years before when we started that to get here is a quite time-consuming process. Thousands of pages of documentation created. I think our internal calculation was that it costed us roughly 2 million to get there. So essentially also quite an investment from our side into the regulative aspect. Yes, from here to launch, obviously there's a monitoring plan around the license. I think it's public what we need to do by when, and there are certain steps that we need to fulfill until 60 days prior to launch, when we have to officially place certain announcements surrounding protective zones for maritime and airspace areas. So yes, and we are in constant monitoring phase with the CAA about these steps to get to launch. Thank you.
So just given that you spoke out the licenses and you say 3 years, £2 million, it's a fair investment. And you said it was long and drawn out. With the CAA, is there anything sort of from someone who's been through it but you think could be improved? Could the cost or the time be brought down, and how does that compare to elsewhere?
As we have our license, I hope you make it more complicated for everyone who comes after.
That'd be good.
Yes.
So in that sense, I leave it to the other people to comment. I would say there's a fairly clear scheme in the UK for the regulation, which was one of the reasons why we came to the UK for launch, because it was very clear and very plannable of what we will have to do. Maybe not knowing that it will take 3 years, but that's siders. There's a clear scheme that the spaceport operator gets a license, they get another license for the range operations, the launch service provider gets one, and then the satellite operator. So quite clear in the distribution of responsibilities, who has to do what, and clear accountability, though it's very uncommon to our customers to apply for themselves for a license. And that is definitely something that is additional effort for us and for them. Because obviously you can see when they go somewhere else to launch, they don't have to do the regulative effort. So it's a downside to our business case and the attractiveness of the overall service offer. So if you want to change something on that end, always look from the customer perspective, please. and look at that regulation element to make it simpler or remove it or do it in another way. That would be our biggest wish.
Thank you. And then finally, just preparations for your first launch. How are those going? And we know, of course, what we've seen in the news that there was issues with your engine tests last year. Has that hampered preparations? Or, I mean, tests are tests, I can understand, but tests, they're not always meant to be 100% perfect. But has that impacted your preparations and sort of timescales?
I haven't seen any issues last year, but maybe you have. We see a lot of learning, obviously, in what we did there in the test campaign. A very big and wonderful image learning from which we advanced. I think every company has to face that and will ultimately face that. If we look at the US, who are a few years in the future with their small launch and launch efforts overall, they went through the same period the last 3-4 years. There were lots of small launch companies, also huge failures on some end on test and launch activities, and they are through that phase. And after 2-3 years now that they have had all these launch attempts and tests, almost none of these companies exist anymore. We've just mentioned earlier today ABL ceasing their commercial launch plans and moving to military completely. Yeah? So that there are 5 to 10 small launch companies in the broader context Europe, or let's say 5 around here in that room, doesn't necessarily mean that A, it will all go flawless for them. We are just furthest advanced to see where the hard things actually are in launch operations, and B, that they're all going to survive this very, very hard phase, which is in front of us, of getting actual hardware to test and to actual operations and trying to demonstrate things. It is hard. It's still rocket science, right? Lots of people say rocket science isn't hard anymore. Be my guest. I would like to extend the invitation that Scott offered earlier. Come around to Augsburg, come around to site and see what operations we really do and build your own impression.
Thanks. Thank you. Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was going to ask Mr. Brooker about HyImpulse. I think I read that in 2023, you said last year you were aiming for a suborbital launch from SaxaVord, and then this year for an orbital launch. You didn't launch last year, so I was wondering if you could update us on your plans.
So we made our suborbital launch last year, which was from the Coonabarra test range in Australia. So I think one of the few European space companies who has launched a rocket, albeit a suborbital rocket, which is not as complex as the orbital vehicle, which we're currently working on now, and which we intend to operate out of SaxaVord. The suborbital vehicle is a test case vehicle, and so we found ourselves in the position where we needed to launch that as soon as we could, and the infrastructure in the Coonabarra test range became available. It's also located next to the Woomera test range, where historically the UK has sent most of its test rockets in the past.
So did you go from Australia because SaxaVord wasn't quite ready yet? Is that
we had SaxaVord and Southern Launch is the name of the company, Australia, as two plans which we worked on at the same time. So we worked on the regulatory process at the same time. It was a good exchange for the CAA and the Australian agency, I believe, working on something that both of them were relatively new to. And eventually the Plan A, which was to launch from SaxaVord, the timeline was overtaken by the infrastructure availability in Australia. And so unfortunately speed is the aim of the game, and the longer term picture is that our intention is to operate orbital services from SaxaVord, and we need to get to that point as soon as we can.
Might that be this year?
No, it won't be this year. No.
Okay, fine. No. So the UK Space Agency, I think, gave you £5 million last year, did it? Not given, but invested. Awarded. You know, is that helping you get that towards that first launch at SaxaVord?
Absolutely, yes. From the point of that suborbital launch, we are now embarking on continuing the program of the orbital vehicle. There's a lot of work to do there. I'm not going to pretend that we're going to launch this year or necessarily next year. But we have a fast-paced programme which we're working on, which is supported by the UK Space Agency as well as the DLR and the European Space Agency.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Elaine Stewart.
This is for Mr Thompson. Skyrora have previously said it's planning a suborbital launch this spring. Are you on track for that, and when might it be?
Thank you. Yes, we are. We were hoping to have that suborbital launch launched in spring of last year, because this was going to be a UK rerun of what we did in Iceland in October 2022. The current status is we are in the final throes of finalising our licence, we hope, and that should be confirmed very soon. And hopefully the stars will align and the queues might fall away, I don't know, and we might be able to find ourselves with a space at SaxaVord Spaceport in the summer. We are obviously negotiating the bird nesting season and the windy seasons, but we still have an aspiration to be able to make that happen. As I mentioned, it will be a proof of concept flight for a space-based telemetry solution. So we're trying to, so as Ruari mentioned there, Skyrora had a program of small launch to demonstrate launch, both to engage, so to demonstrate its capability, to introduce the concept to society, and including to the regulator. And the idea was to go through iterations of small launch to prove what launch meant, both to, as I said, to ourselves, that we had the processes in place. So this suborbital launch is the final launch in that program before we attempt or broach the orbital launch vehicle, which we are finalising the manufacturing of this year. So, yeah, as I said, that's what we have planned.
Does the frustration still lie with the CAA's licensing? And can you maybe expand a wee bit on that if that is the case?
Thank you. Yeah, I started engaging with the CAA in 2019. We had, as a new company at that point, you may remember, March was the Brexit day. We wanted to launch a vehicle at the end of March on Brexit day. We started talking to the CAA at the end of February 2019. That was for a small 4-metre vehicle, 2-stage, just to do a small test launch, again, as I just mentioned, part of the proof of concept. That engagement lasted 23 months. We eventually came up with what we felt was a robust safety case, and the CAA at that point recognised that we had engaged with a range service provider, with a spaceport provider. We'd sat down and said, yeah, we think we can do this, to make them more comfortable. At that point, the CAA then was officially recognised and stood up as the regulator for spaceflight, and the new team, when it was appointed, basically said, the work that you've just done, you have to put it on hold. You can't launch until you have a licence under the new regime. The Space Industry Act of 2018, then the Space Industry Regulations of 2021, were approved and came into force at the end of the summer. We then started engaging with the CAA in 2021 in September because, as I think was mentioned, and again I think Scott mentioned it a little bit earlier on, this is all about a learning game. We need to share information. We need to be able to sit down collaboratively with our partners, and by this I mean also the regulator, to allow them to learn the activity that we're proposing to undertake. From our point of view, it's all about trying to achieve that golden medium, somewhere in between not getting too close to the regulator, but at the same time making sure that they have complete, full understanding of all the processes that we are undertaking, including, and we've sought different ways to do that, including learning the lessons of our Iceland launch, etc. Yeah, we've been round the block a few times, I think, with regards to this. As I said, we went to Iceland to launch because we got tired of waiting. We ended up creating the regulations, allowing the Icelandic to adopt an act of parliament, and they gave us a flight, a certificate to allow us to launch in Iceland in the October 2022. In March 23, there was the Science Tech Select Committee, which was deliberating on the 1st of March, deliberating over the Virgin Orbit launch and the challenges of that, and the CAA was not coming out of that terribly well. On the 16th of May that year, we had a visit from the board of the CAA to come to see us, and they made an announcement about their moving forward. They asked us what it is that we wanted. The one thing I asked of the CAA was engagement. We have only just achieved the level of engagement necessary for us to be able to process and finalise that licence. And that was the second attempt to have a licence. The first one, we actually submitted our orbital licence application back in March of 2022. For this specific launch that you asked me about in your previous question, we were encouraged to submit a licence application by the Minister of Transport in July 2023, which is why I mentioned we were hoping to launch in the spring of 24, then in the autumn of 24, and it's been pushed back again because the licence process extended. And extended because, again, perfectly honest with you, they're doing it for the first time. We appreciate that. But in every attempt for us to sit down and engage with them, to allow them to share information and understand us better, up until this point, we haven't really managed to get there. So, yes, the achievement of us getting a licence, hopefully very soon, will be an enormous achievement. It will be, since 2019, we've been working on this case.
I hear your frustration loud and clear, and I hope that happens soon for you. Just moving on, what extent do your future plans for the manufacturing in Cumbernauld depend on the outcome of your first launch?
We are highly committed to Cumbernauld. I'm delighted to say that in our slowed attempts to get our licence, we've actually been successful in developing our commercial capabilities. So the capabilities we represent in-house, including particularly around propulsion engineering, we have now, as part of our funding programme, as part of our financial makeup going forward, we've been successful at securing a couple of commercial deliverables. We're looking to do more, particularly in the area of propulsion engineering. And as, again, mentioned, I think, by Nick Smith, we have started engaging in particular with MOD framework programs where we believe we'll be, again, be able to deploy some of that capability going forward. So we are highly committed to our Cumbernauld site. We are already bursting out of it. We employed 40 people over the last 3 months. We need more space. We are looking to grow. We still require investment to achieve the total commercial value offering for space as we envisage it. But with the appearance of these commercial deliverables, these contracts, we are in a much better place than we were even just a year ago, because it's given us confidence, it's given us the opportunity to again, live off our own revenues and actually build that going forward. So from the point of view of our launch in the summer, yes, while a year ago, had we launched in spring, the suborbital launch would have been a massive demonstrator and a proof of concept to a large number of potential investors, etc. Hopefully successful, as we all hope. Now the pressure is not so much on that. There's still pressure there, because obviously we want to be successful and we want to be able to move forward faster. But I'm delighted to be able to say that the company's in much better shape right now, and we are highly committed to our location in Cumbernauld, and as I said, in growing that.
Thank you.
Maureen Burke. Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I ask what engagement have you each had with the UK and Scottish governments as you have developed your launch plans? I'll ask Mr. Brooker to go.
So we have a long-standing engagement with both governments, with Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Development International on the Scottish Government side, and with primarily the UK Space Agency, but also Department for Transport, the CAA, and Department for Trade as well. So engagement on all sides is very good there. Everyone is very keen to see this happen. There's a lot of enthusiasm from all of those agencies to make space, and particularly launch, a growth area for the United Kingdom and Scotland going forward.
Mr. Burnham, could you go next?
I think overall the engagement has on all sides been very good with Highlands and Islands or the Scottish Government overall, but also with UK's ADCIT and the UK Government. Very supportive. I think the strategy for national launch, which is number one, is actually on the agenda of UK space strategy, helped obviously a lot to get these interactions going. I think also the Pathfinder programs that it did initially to spur these ecosystems, the UK was really early with all of these initiatives, right? One of the first countries around here having Space Act in place, the support programs with the Pathfinder missions. I would say somewhat then it stopped. So I would ask, why don't you continue, right? You were the first, you attracted all the people which are now in that room, all to that UK location in Scotland to actually do launch. I wouldn't stop it. It's all about attracting companies to come and stay, and I think the come has worked. This stay is what needs to be worked at and what we are trying to do and build in these engagements. And I think it has been mentioned several times before, we are service providers for transportation to space, and ideally the best support we can get is contracts for these transport demonstrations in whatever context you deem feasible. R&D launches for university satellite projects, or on the other end, part of NATO programs, the start of programs to make it multinational corporations to deliver under that framework. So there's a wide variety of what we can think of and what we are trying to actively push in these discussions to get support for.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
As I mentioned, I think we engaged with SEPA actually early doors in 2020, I think it was, around the data angle, because in particular, Scottish Government also, with the adoption of the Scottish Space Strategy and the Environmental Task Force, taken an environmental angle to the development of space. Yes, we've been supporting that, heavily involved in informing that work. We obviously, we were engaging with SEPA on two levels, not just to understand their demand for data going forward, but also to understand how they were going to regulate our engine test activity from the point of view of emissions, etc. We've been heavily active in the cross-party group in Holyrood, more recently helping that be set up and also field some of the questions and have useful engagement with the MSPs and the Minister. In fact, we had a great engagement with Ivan McKee when he was Minister, and indeed we have a good relationship with Richard Lockheed. At Westminster we had great representation. In fact, we initiated or allowed, in collaboration with our MP at the time, on the 5th of February 2021, we had a space debate. You may remember it. And that then led into the Science and Tech Select Committee inquiry into space and the new space regulations in the Space Industry Act. And colleagues, we obviously presented evidence at that about the success and the development and the implementation of the strategy. So yeah, we've been seeking every opportunity to engage, to try to, first of all, as I mentioned already, share information about where we're at. Second of all, to understand how we can achieve better accountability and better support for the civil servants who need to be working with us through collaboration and partnership to allow us to do what we need to do, which is deliver the economic benefits, the jobs, the prosperity that we all so want to do.
Thank you for that. I think you've kind of alluded into my second part of the question, which was what further support could you expect from the Scottish Government and the UK Government? Is there anything else you think that they could provide that would support what you're doing?
So from my point of view, it's continued engagement and better understanding of what we want to put forward in the area of responsive launch. We believe there's a big opportunity now that the United Kingdom has into NATO in a programme called Starlift, and we are championing this concept of responsive launch. As I mentioned already, we believe this is something incredibly valuable that we can demonstrate here and as I said, represent that with the entire country capability into a NATO engagement. We anticipate another 5 to 10 year programme where we can, again, represent, develop, use this as an economic driver to develop the academic opportunities Strathclyde University, Aerospace Centre for Excellence, etc., etc., Heriot-Watt University, propulsion. So yeah, there's, I think, simple answer to the question is greater alignment, greater engagement so that we can actually broach these opportunities together. At this precise moment in time, yes, we are, as I mentioned, still looking for a bit of investment, but from our point of view, we think we're in a confident place to be able to achieve that. So we think we are now hopefully being able to deliver against the economic promises we're making to the country and to Scotland in the first place.
Thank you for that.
Would either of the other witnesses like to add anything to that?
Fun fact. I don't know if you all have seen this green logo that you see everywhere on the chairs and on the television screens. If you look at it, probably you look at the green part and at the bottom of it, which is spears. If I look at it, I look at the black part on the bottom, because you see the perfect shape of a nozzle of an engine. There are 4 engines next to another, perfectly aligned. So you are actually accelerated here by rocket engines already.
That's good to know. We'll take that to heart. Mr. Brooker, did you want
so
to add anything?
Your question is what more can the governments do to support? And I think there's been great support there. So we are well supported by the UK Space Agency and others. And I think going back to one of the things that Nick mentioned is that while we are going for a situation where we can be commercially successful without government intervention, there are no launch companies in the world who have become successful without some kind of government intervention. And the question is, what's the best kind of intervention? And to date, most of that has been through R&D support. But I think I would echo what Jörn said about contracts for launch. And that's one way in which we can go to investors and say, look, we don't just receive some money, we receive a customer as well, or options for customers. And that's a very powerful thing that the state can leverage, because the state is a customer of space products, space data, satellite capabilities in space. And there are many ways in which that could be leveraged in order to support the launch industry from the UK. Yeah. I think one of the other things that we haven't mentioned yet, but is also, there's a big push in European Space Agency members at the moment to try and build up a commercially successful European sovereign capability, and one of these programs at the moment is called the European Launcher Challenge, and I think the UK's participation in that challenge will be key to securing the future of the UK launch industry as well as the European launch industry.
Thank you very much. That was our last question of the morning. So I'd like to thank, on behalf of the committee, all of the panellists for a fascinating session. I think we've all learned a huge amount this morning, and we're very grateful to you for giving us your time. Thank you. Order. Meeting will now close. But if I could ask members to remain behind for a couple of minutes, it would be very helpful.